Welcome to the program. We're analyzing a landmark 2027-2037 roadmap by Jaffar Humayoon, Rebuilding School Education for the AI Age. This isn't just another tech update, it's a human cognitive capability reform. As AI automates recall and procedural execution, this policy argues that the traditional model of schooling is becoming obsolete. We're exploring a 10-year plan to move beyond structural adjustments to a total cognitive transformation. Today, we break down how this framework intends to preserve foundational mastery while institutionalizing the high-level judgment needed to maintain human intellectual sovereignty in an automated civilization.
And I have to say, just looking at the sheer scale of this document, it is massive. I mean, the first thing we really need to do here is strip away some of the buzzwords. Because a phrase like cognitive transformation, it sounds like something you'd hear at a generic tech conference, right?
Yeah, it sounds like a pitch deck.
Exactly. But what Humayun is actually proposing in this paper is quite terrifying, to be honest, but arguably very necessary.
Terrifying in what way, though? Just because of how big it is?
Because of the diagnosis itself. Usually when we look at these education reform deep dives, we've done a few of them on the show.
Quite a few, yeah.
The conversation is almost always about the tools. It's always, how do we integrate tablets, or should we ban ChatGPT or whatever? It's very tactical, very on the ground.
Right. Nailing down the nuts and bolts.
Right. But this roadmap argues that all of that is basically just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It suggests that the entire operating system of how we teach human beings, the very architecture of the school day that we've relied on for over 100 years, is actively producing obsolete minds.
Wow. Okay, that is a heavy opener. So we aren't just talking about updating a curriculum here. We're talking about literally rewiring the students.
Literally rewiring, yes. Yeah. The paper focuses heavily on what it calls the cognitive architecture. And to really grasp why this 2027 roadmap is so radical, you have to look at the economic reality it's responding to. The author introduces this concept right at the beginning called the automation boundary.
Yeah, I highlighted that exact section, actually, the automation boundary. It sounds a bit like a sci-fi border or something, but in this context, he means it economically right.
Right. Think of the automation boundary as this rising tide. For the last century or so, schools were essentially operating as factories designed to transfer what the paper calls codified knowledge.
Codified meaning things we can just write down.
Exactly. If you can put it in a textbook or a manual or a standard operating procedure or even a structured database, it is codified. So dates of historical battles, the periodic table rules of grammar, standard mathematical formulas, all of that.
The stuff we all had to memorize.
Yeah. The value of a student entering the workforce in, say, 1990 or even 2010 was largely determined by how much of this codified info they could hold in their head and then retrieve on command.
Which is funny because we just called that being smart. If you knew the capital of every country and you could do long division without a calculator, you were the smart kid in class. You were going to be the valuable employee.
You were a walking encyclopedia. That was the goal. But the roadmap argues that modern AI, specifically these large language models and the reasoning engines coming out now, has essentially swallowed the entire corpus of codified human knowledge. It has mastered recall, it has mastered pattern recognition, and it's mastered rule-based application.
So if I'm an educator and I'm testing a student on who signed the Magna Carta or asking them to solve for X using the quadratic formula, I'm testing them on a skill that a machine can do instantly, perfectly, and basically for free.
And that is the absolute crux of the crisis right there. The paper argues that if a task can be fully specified in advance, meaning if I can sit down and write out steps 1 through 10 on how to do it, it will be automated. It's not a matter of if, it's just when.
Wow.
So if your entire school system is designed to produce graduates who are excellent at following step-by-step instructions and recalling facts.
We are basically building robots, except flesh and blood robots are a lot slower and way more expensive than the digital ones.
Precisely. We are training them for obsolescence. The automation boundary has already moved way past the point of basic knowledge retrieval. So the core mission of this roadmap, and really the reason why it maps out a full 10 years to implement, is to figure out what is actually left. If the AI holds the database, what is the human's job?
That's the existential question, isn't it? If the machine does the knowing, what does the human do? The paper uses this really striking phrase, human intellectual sovereignty, which frankly sounds a bit like we're fighting a war against the machines.
Well, in a cognitive sense, we kind of are. We are fighting for relevance. Humayoon identifies the new value zone for humans as the uncodifiable.
The uncodifiable. Okay, give me some examples of what that looks like in practice.
Judgment under uncertainty. That's the really big one. AI loves rules. It thrives on clear parameters. But humans are needed when the rules are broken or when two valid rules conflict with each other.
Okay, so navigating the gray areas.
Exactly. For example, an AI can design a bridge that is mathematically absolutely perfect. It won't fall down. But can that AI decide where to put the bridge if it involves, say, displacing a historic community versus destroying a protected wetland?
Oh, I see. Because that's a value judgment. That involves ethics and human context.
Right. That's ethical reasoning and trade-off analysis. The paper also lists cross-domain integration. So taking a nuanced concept from 19th century literature and applying it to a problem in modern behavioral economics, these are things that require a chaotic, messy human synthesis that algorithms really struggle with.
So the shift they're proposing is moving from knowledge retrieval to something more like wisdom application.
You could definitely frame it that way, but what's interesting is how critical the paper is of how we are currently trying to make that shift. And this brings us right into Section 1, which covers the strategic opportunity. Humayoon argues that our current education reforms are just structural adjustments when what we actually need is cognitive transformation.
What's the difference there? Because I feel like I see headlines every single week about schools modernizing or changing their approach.
We'll look closely at what those headlines actually say. It's usually something like school board votes to remove exams to lower student stress, or a district reduces homework to improve mental health, or the curriculum is updated to include digital literacy classes.
Yeah, that sounds like the typical news cycle.
The paper argues that these are well-intentioned moves, absolutely. But they are essentially a retreat. They are making school easier or lighter simply because the old model feels heavy and outdated.
But making it easier doesn't necessarily make the student more valuable in this new AI economy.
Exactly. In fact, it might make them significantly less valuable. If you remove the rigor of learning just because Google has the answer or ChatGPT can write it, you aren't building the high-level judgment needed to control the AI. You're just creating a passive user.
A consumer of the tech rather than a master of it.
Right, and that's a massive distinction in this roadmap. The stated goal is to create architects of intelligence, not just users of tools.
And I think that's a perfect segue into Section 2, because this is where the paper really caught me off guard. I went into this expecting it to say, the old ways are dead, let's just do creative finger painting projects all day. But it actually doubles down on something that most modern educators seem to actively hate right now.
You're talking about applied rote.
Yes. Rote learning, memorization, endless drills. The paper explicitly calls for an end to what it calls the false binary between rote learning and critical thinking. And I have to be honest, when I first read that, I bristled a bit. Because isn't rote learning the exact thing we just agreed that AI can do perfectly? Why on earth would we force human kids to do it?
It is easily the most controversial part of the roadmap, but it's also the most scientifically grounded. To really understand why Humayoon is pushing this, we have to open up the hood of the human brain and look at cognitive load theory.
Okay, lay the science on us. Why does a kid in 2027 still need to memorize the multiplication tables?
Okay, so imagine your brain has two main areas for this, a workbench and a warehouse. The workbench is your working memory. It's where you actively process new information. And the thing about the workbench is that it's extremely small. You can only hold about 4 to 7 items there at any given time.
Oh, which explains why I instantly forget a phone number if someone interrupts me while I'm dialing. My workbench just gets wiped.
Exactly. It gets flooded. Now, the warehouse, on the other hand, is your long-term memory. And for all practical purposes, that is effectively infinite. The entire goal of learning anything is to move information from that tiny workbench into the massive warehouse so you can access it automatically without thinking. This is a concept called automaticity.
Like driving a car. When I was 16, I had to think about the gas pedal, the rearview mirror, the turn signal. My workbench was totally jammed. I couldn't even listen to the radio or talk to anyone. But now I can drive on the highway, listen to a deep dive, and drink my coffee all at the same time.
Precisely because the skill of driving has moved into your warehouse. It's automatic now. So apply that same biological reality to a student. Suppose you want a high school student to do some deep critical thinking about a complex history essay. Say they're analyzing the intersecting geopolitical causes of World War I. That is a very high-level synthesis task.
Right, that's the uncodifiable judgment we want.
But if that student has to stop every 10 seconds to look up a date on their phone or check a map to see where Germany is, or remember who the Archduke was, their workbench is constantly flooded with basic retrieval tasks. They literally have no cognitive space left to do the synthesis.
Oh, wow. So the paper is arguing that you physically cannot think critically about a subject if you haven't already memorized the foundational facts about it.
That is exactly the argument. There is a great line in the paper. You cannot write a nuanced, complex novel if you are still struggling to remember how to spell the word "the."
That makes so much sense.
The paper warns that if we strip away memorization just because AI can do it for us, we are paradoxically crippling the student's biological ability to think deeply.
That's what they call the paradox of applied rote. We actually need to memorize more, or at least memorize specific foundational things much more deeply, so that our brains are freed up to handle the complex, messy stuff that the AI throws at us.
Correct. The sequence here is absolutely non-negotiable in this framework. It has to happen in order. First is foundational mastery, which is stocking the warehouse. Second is systemic reasoning, which is the synthesis part. And only third comes AI collaborative judgment.
And what happens if you try to skip step one? Say you just hand a kid an iPad in first grade.
The paper says if you remove the foundation, reasoning collapses. You get students who know how to use the shiny tools, but they can't spot when the tool is hallucinating or lying to them. You get students who can generate a perfectly formatted generic essay using ChatGPT, but they can't actually critique the logic within it because they don't possess the internal knowledge of the subject matter.
Which leads right into Principle 1 in the document, thinking before tools. It lays down a very hard rule for how we assess students. It says they are evaluated on the framing, the critique, and the correction of AI, but never just on tool usage alone.
This is their definition of treating AI as a reasoning amplifier rather than a crutch. The roadmap is incredibly strict about this. You don't get an A just for prompting the AI to write a poem. Any machine can do that. You get an A for prompting the poem, analyzing its structural and thematic flaws, and then editing it to be vastly superior to what the machine originally produced.
You essentially have to be the editor-in-chief.
Yes. And you simply cannot be a good editor if you don't know the rules of grammar or the historical context of poetry. That's why the rote learning has to come back. You need that deep internal knowledge to properly judge the external digital output.
There's a third principle here in Section 2 that feels like the real social conscience of the whole document. It's called equity as a structural constraint. Now, you and I talk a lot on this program about the digital divide, people who have fast internet versus people who don't. But this paper is talking about something much scarier, a cognitive divide.
The two-tier system risk. This is the absolute nightmare scenario that Humayoon is trying to prevent. So imagine two different schools. School A is a wealthy, elite private academy in the suburbs. School B is an under-resourced public school in the inner city or a rural area.
Okay, tracking with you.
In School A, because they have abundant resources and highly trained teachers, they use AI to leverage high-order cognition. They skip the drudgery. The kids use AI to build complex economic models, design sustainable cities, run climate simulations. They're actively training to become the architects of the future.
And in School B?
In School B, where experienced teachers are scarce and funding is tied to basic test scores, they might use AI as just a cheap substitute for human teaching. They sit the kids in front of an AI tutor that just runs them through endless procedural drills all day. It's cheap, it's incredibly efficient, and it probably improves their standardized test scores, but it only creates compliant rule followers.
Wow. So the rich kids are learning how to command the AI while the poor kids are basically learning how to be commanded by the AI.
That is the exact danger. The roadmap argues passionately that higher-order cognition must be treated as a fundamental human right, not an elective, not an enrichment program for the gifted kids. Right. We cannot allow a system where deep thinking becomes a luxury good.
Because if we automate the bottom of the cognitive ladder, the basic procedural skills, we have to ensure that absolutely everyone gets pulled up to the top rungs. Otherwise, we are baking a permanent class divide right into the biological brains of the next generation.
A permanent cognitive underclass. And that's exactly why the how of this roadmap, what they call the three-phase cognitive architecture, is so incredibly rigid. It doesn't leave this progression up to chance or local school board budgets. It mandates a very specific developmental progression for every single student, regardless of their zip code.
Let's get into that structure then, because this is really the meat of the proposal. It breaks the next 10 years of a student's life into three very distinct phases. In phase 1, looking at it here, it honestly sounds a bit like boot camp.
Phase 1 is called foundational encoding. and it covers grades 1 through 5.
And I'm looking at the time allocation ratio here. It says 80 to 90% structured encoding and reinforcement. That sounds, I mean, to be blunt, that sounds incredibly boring for a 7-year-old.
Oh, to a modern progressive educator, it sounds absolutely draconian. But you have to remember, the ultimate goal here is universal automaticity. The roadmap points out that between the ages of 6 and 11, the human brain is at its absolute most plastic for language and pattern acquisition.
So this is where we just drill the times tables, the grammar rules, the spelling, the basic historical timelines over and over.
Yes, and they introduce a crucial new pedagogy here called attention discipline. It includes what they call deliberate practice cycles. So it's not just about memorizing facts for the sake of knowing them. It's about physically training the child's brain to focus on a single unstimulating task for extended periods of time.
Which is basically the exact opposite of what an iPad or smartphone does to a brain.
Exactly the opposite. The argument Humayoon makes is that before you can safely hand a child a device that gives them access to the world's knowledge in 3 seconds, you have to build up their internal armor of focus.
That makes sense.
If you skip this phase, if you try to make elementary school all about fun exploration and self-directed digital play without any of the rigor, you end up with a high schooler who is cognitively fragile. They can't read a long, challenging text. They can't hold complex mental math in their head. They become entirely dependent on their digital exoskeleton to do the thinking for them.
So grades 1 through 5 are really just about building the engine. We aren't racing the car yet. We are just making absolutely sure that the pistons can fire reliably.
Right. It's about protecting their long-term cognitive capacity.
Right.
Then once that foundation is solid, we shift gears. That brings us to phase 2, which is transitional applied integration. This covers grades 6 through 9.
I see the ratio shifts quite a bit here. It goes down to 60 to 70% rote learning, but now we start applying it more.
This is the critical bridge phase. You are moving the student from merely knowing things to actually using things. And the key mechanism they introduce here is cross-disciplinary exposure.
How does that look practically?
Well, in phase 1, you learned your math in math class and your history in history class. They were siloed. In phase 2, you might be asked to use your statistical math skills to analyze a historical trend, like population shifts during the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, so you're verifying that the automaticity you build in phase 1 actually works in the wild when the subjects get matched together?
Exactly. And this is also where you start introducing collaborative learning. But notice, it only comes after the foundation is built. The paper is very clear that you cannot collaborate effectively if you bring absolutely nothing to the table.
That's such a good point because we've all been in those group projects where collaboration really just means the one smart kid does all the actual work and everyone else just watches and puts their name on it. But if everyone has that rock-solid foundation from phase 1...
then the collaboration is actually about true synthesis, not just academic survival. And that transitional phase perfectly sets the stage for the final act. Phase 3, applied specialization and mastery, grades 10 through 12.
This is where the root learning basically disappears entirely, right?
It drops down to what they call embedded only. So by the time you are 16 years old under this new model, you shouldn't need flashcards anymore. You are now essentially a junior practitioner. The activities listed for high schoolers here are fascinating. They talk about capstone, mission simulations, and the dreaded oral defense.
It sounds like they are treating 17-year-old high school seniors like university graduate students defending a thesis.
They absolutely have to. Because think about the world an 18-year-old is entering in 2037. They are competing in a job market against AI agents that are vastly smarter, faster, and cheaper than any human at basic cognitive tasks. If that 18-year-old only knows how to fill out a multiple-choice test, they are economically invalid from day 1.
That is terrifying but true.
Phase 3 is all about ensuring they are AI resilient. They need to be able to look at a highly complex, messy problem. The paper uses the example of designing climate resilience infrastructure for a specific local neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they have to design a solution, defend their choices, and adapt it on the fly when new constraints are added.
Which brings us to the massive elephant in the room, assessment. Because if you are changing the way kids learn this drastically, you obviously can't just hand them a Stantron bubble sheet at the end of the year and call it a day.
No, you can't. The paper declares that the reliability problem of the written essay is completely dead. We just have to accept that reality.
Right, because the AI can write the 5-paragraph essay perfectly in 2 seconds.
Better than the student ever could. So Section 4 of the roadmap introduces the new assessment model, and the absolute centerpiece of this is the oral defense.
I love this idea in theory, but it also kind of scares me for the kids. Standing up in front of a panel of adults, that is incredibly intense for a teenager.
It is intense, but it is also much harder to fake. You can buy an essay online. You can use an AI to generate a brilliant coding project. But you cannot fake your way through a 20-minute live grilling by a panel of teachers who are relentlessly asking you why you made those specific choices.
It forces you to genuinely own the knowledge. You can't hide behind the final product.
Exactly. It shifts the entire metric of schooling from product to process. We don't care about the final polished paper anymore. We only care about your real-time ability to defend the human thinking behind it. It basically turns the high school exam room into a corporate boardroom.
But logistically, that sounds like an absolute nightmare for schools. Grading a multiple choice test takes a computer 5 seconds. An oral defense takes 30 minutes per student. How do public school systems possibly scale that up?
That leads to what I think is the most provocative part of the entire assessment strategy. The paper suggests using AI to grade the humans.
Okay, hold on a second. We just spent the last 30 minutes talking about how we need to build intellectual sovereignty and not let the AI take over human judgment. And now the roadmap is saying the AI is going to be the one giving me my final report card. That feels entirely contradictory, like the fox guarding a henhouse.
I fully anticipated that reaction. It does sound completely contradictory at first glance. But let's look closely at what they call the moderator concept. The paper is keenly aware of human teacher bias.
Sure, some teachers are just naturally harder graders than others. Some might have unconscious biases based on a student's background.
Exactly. So in this new model, the AI doesn't just arbitrarily spit out a letter grade. It acts as a calibration engine. It records the entire oral defense. It transcribes the student's spoken arguments in real time. And then it compares that specific student's performance against a massive anonymized data set of millions of other students to check for consistency.
Oh, so it's not just grading the students, actually checking the teacher's judgment.
It's checking the variance, yes. It detects what they call rubric alignment. It's constantly looking for inter-school calibration. It asks the systemic question, is an A grade given in a rural, underfunded school statistically equivalent in rigor to an A grade given in an elite prep school?
I see. So it's actually functioning as an equity tool. It prevents the elite schools from quietly grade inflating their wealthy students while ensuring the rural schools aren't getting graded unfairly harshly.
Precisely. It uses the machine's sheer computing power to process vast amounts of data just to ensure fundamental fairness across the entire system. It's an audit trail. The human teacher still conducts the defense and guides the conversation, but the AI ensures the grading standard remains universal.
Okay, that makes it a lot more palatable. I still feel a little uneasy about an algorithm having a say in my kid's fate.
Yeah.
But if it's functioning as a background audit tool, that's a different story.
It's a necessary checks and balances system. And frankly, without the AI doing that heavy lifting of calibration, the entire portfolio and oral defense model just falls apart because human grading is vastly too subjective to scale nationally.
Let's pivot to the people who are actually inside this machine. Section 5 covers the human element. Because all of this grand structure, the 3 phases, the oral defenses, the AI audits, it all relies entirely on flesh and blood human beings executing it every day.
And this is where the paper gets very psychological, which I found fascinating. It dedicates a whole section to building an emotional and metacognitive architecture.
Metacognition, meaning thinking about how we think.
Right. The reform argues that living and working in an AI age requires a very specific kind of emotional regulation. Think about it. If you have a machine sitting on your desk that is objectively smarter and faster than you at almost everything, how do you not just feel constantly inferior? How do you maintain the internal motivation to even bother learning anything?
That's a real crisis right now. I've heard so many people ask recently, why should my kid learn to code if the AI can already do it flawlessly?
The answer the paper provides to that existential dread is a concept called epistemic humility.
Unpack that for us. What does epistemic humility actually mean in a classroom?
Epistemic humility is the disciplined practice of clearly identifying what you don't know. In a world where information is infinite and instantly accessible, the biggest danger to a student isn't ignorance. It's the illusion of knowledge. It's a teenager thinking they deeply understand quantum physics just because they read a perfectly formatted 3-paragraph AI summary of it.
So the school system needs to actively train kids to say, I don't know, or I need to verify that source before I trust it.
Yes. And they pair that with digital skepticism. Now, this isn't just the old media literacy class about spotting fake news on Facebook. It's much deeper. It's about understanding the underlying incentives behind the information architecture. It's about teaching a 15-year-old to instinctively ask, why is this specific algorithm showing me this specific output at this exact moment?
And the paper outlines a developmental progression for this emotional training too,
It
right?
does. Phase 1 is that attention discipline we talked about earlier. Phase 2 introduces reflection journals and basic cognitive bias recognition. And Phase 3 culminates in these high-level ethical design labs.
It's basically building an inner armor. If phase one builds the memory warehouse, this section builds the moral character to wield it.
Beautifully put. But the linchpin here, and the paper's very honest about this, is the teachers. Section 5 explicitly calls the teaching workforce the critical constraint of the entire 2027 roadmap.
It's the classic bottleneck. You can have the most visionary policy document in the world, but if the exhausted teacher in the actual classroom is still operating on a 20th century model, the whole thing fails.
And we are asking them to do so much more in this model. We're asking them to be cognitive scientists managing working memory, then mentors, then oral examiners, and finally data analysts. It's a wildly different job description.
Which is why the paper proposes creating entirely new credentials. It suggests we completely stop treating teacher as a single generic job title.
Right. It splits them into highly specialized roles. For grades 1 through 5, you would have the foundational cognitive pedagogy credential.
Which focuses heavily on the raw science of memory retention and fluency.
Exactly. These teachers aren't just reading storybooks. They are specialists in synaptic encoding. They know exactly how to move data into a child's long-term warehouse.
And then for high school, they propose the capstone mentorship credential.
Which is a totally different skill set. These high school educators act more like university thesis advisors or corporate project managers. They aren't standing at the front of a room lecturing at a whiteboard. They are moving around the room guiding small, autonomous teams through complex, multi-week projects.
But how on earth do we prevent systemic burnout? Because teachers are already quitting in droves right now under the current system. If we add all this on top,
The paper acknowledges that crisis. It proposes a national cognitive pedagogy residency model, which is structured very much like how medical doctors do their residencies. But the real key to preventing teacher burnout, paradoxically enough, is heavily utilizing more AI.
so using the disease as the cure.
In a way, yes. The roadmap suggests comprehensive AI-assisted lesson planning. The core idea is that the AI backend handles all the administrative drudgery, the paperwork, the scheduling, the basic lesson generation, the rubric alignments, and the grading calibration we talked about. By offloading the bureaucracy, it physically frees the human teacher to do the one single thing the AI cannot do: provide genuine human connection and personal mentorship.
So the teacher becomes significantly less of a bureaucrat and much more of a life coach.
That's the hope. But transitioning to that requires a massive retraining of the existing workforce. Hundreds of thousands of adults need to relearn their profession, and that costs a tremendous amount of money.
Which brings us to the final section of our deep dive today: implementation risks and the future, the actual 2027 to 2037 roadmap,
Section 6, where the rubber finally meets the road.
and where the wallet meets the vacuum cleaner. Because the paper fully admits this is going to be incredibly expensive, it uses a phrase called a transitional duplication buffer.
Yeah, that's a very polite, fancy economic term for a really painful reality. What Humayoon is saying is that for about 3 to 4 years, roughly between 2027 and 2030, society's going to have to pay for two completely different education systems simultaneously.
Because you're keeping the old standardized exams and the old textbook contracts running.
Exactly. While at the exact same time, you are funding the new digital portfolios, paying to train the new specialized teachers, and funding the pilot innovation schools. You can't just flip a switch on a Tuesday and change an entire nation's education system. You have to run them in parallel until the new one can bear the load.
That is going to be an incredibly tough sell for taxpayers. Imagine a politician standing up and saying, hey, everyone, we need double the education budget for the next 3 years to fix everything.
It is a brutal political sell.
Yeah.
But Humayun's counter-argument, the return on investment that he pitches, is the massive long-term reduction in what he calls shadow education.
Shadow education, you mean the private tutoring industry?
Exactly. Kumon Mathnasium private SAT prep cram schools. In many countries right now, parents are individually spending billions of dollars out of pocket on this shadow system because the public schools simply aren't delivering foundational results. The roadmap argues that if public schools actually ensure true foundational mastery in Phase 1 and systemic thinking in Phase 3, the need for parents to buy private remediation just collapses.
So the pitch is you pay a bit more in public taxes now, but you save thousands in private tuition and tutoring later.
Right. And you also massively lower the remediation rates in universities. Because right now, colleges are spending an absolute fortune teaching college freshmen how to write basic analytical sentences that they should have mastered in the 8th grade.
That makes a lot of sense economically. But let's talk about the risks if this goes wrong. We already touched on the two-tier system risk, but there's another major one listed here called higher ed alignment.
This is the ultimate chicken and egg problem of education reform.
Yep.
So imagine you're a progressive high school principal. You go all in on this 2027 roadmap. Your senior students build these amazing complex portfolios. They are brilliant systemic thinkers. They've done rigorous oral defenses.
They sound like the absolute dream candidates for any college.
To do. But then the university admissions office at the state college still only asks for a standardized SAT score and a traditional GPA based on multiple choice tests.
Oh, I see. So the parents completely revolt. They march into the principal's office and say, stop teaching my kid to be a systemic thinker. Teach them how to hack the bubble test so they can get into a good college.
Exactly. If higher ed doesn't fundamentally change its intake valves to accept these new portfolios and oral defenses, the high schools will immediately revert to teaching to the test. The social pressure from parents is just too high to resist.
So the universities basically have to jump first, or at least coordinate the jump at the exact same time.
It has to be perfectly synchronized, which is why the paper calls for a federally coordinated, competency-aligned exam structure to be fully in place by 2034.
It's a massive logistical coordination problem. But let's zoom out and look at the final destination. If, and obviously it's a massive if we actually pull this 10-year plan off, what does the graduating class of 2037 actually look like?
The stated vision is universal foundational fluency, meaning absolutely no student leaves the 5th grade without the ability to read deeply or do mental math. Honestly, that alone would be a historical revolution in public education.
And for the older kids, the high school graduates.
A vast majority of them become systemic thinkers. We get a generation of adults that isn't just good at answering the questions placed in front of them, but is actually skilled at framing the right questions to ask in the first place.
The phrase Humayoon uses at the end is AI resilient.
And that really is the ultimate goal, not AI dependent, AI resilient. These students will use the tool, they will master the tool, but they will never be subservient to the tool.
You know what really strikes me about this entire deep dive is that for a massive policy document explicitly about the AI age, it's incredibly human-centric.
It has to be.
It's almost like the looming presence of superintelligent AI is forcing us to finally figure out what we actually are, what makes us human.
That is the grand paradox of this whole era. The better the machines get at being machines, the more pressure there is on us to get much better at being human. We simply can't afford to be mediocre robots anymore. We have to be exceptional humans.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. The average is essentially being automated away.
Correct. The middle ground is disappearing entirely. You either fall below the API and you just become a compliant task completer taking orders from a screen, or you rise above the API and become a system designer. This entire roadmap is ultimately just an attempt to build a sturdy ladder so that every single kid can climb above the API.
It's a deeply hopeful vision, even if the sheer logistics of it are a total nightmare.
It is incredibly necessary work, because the alternative is a slow, quiet slide into total cognitive dependency, where we literally forget how to think because the machine is always there to do it for us.
And that is absolutely a future we want to avoid. If you're listening and you have kids in the system, this is the battleground for the next decade. We've unpacked the automation boundary, the controversial return of applied rote learning, the shift to oral defenses, and the heavy new burden on our teachers. It is definitely a lot to digest.
But it is a comprehensive blueprint for survival.
As we close, remember the core premise of this reform. AI will master anything that can be codified or written down. To survive this shift, education must protect the uncodifiable synthesis, ethical reasoning, and judgment under uncertainty. This policy doesn't just aim for digital fluency, it seeks to ensure students are AI resilient rather than AI dependent. The blueprint is set, but as the paper warns, the real test lies in teacher transformation and preventing a new cognitive inequality between the rich and the poor. Thanks for joining us as we explore the future of the human mind. Next time, we look at the first pilot schools leading this charge.